Flight attendant rips up black girl's ticket, not knowing her father owns the entire airline. Airports have their own kind of rhythm, suitcases rolling in quick bursts, boarding calls echoing through overhead speakers, and families hurrying between gates as if each second were measured against something more than time. In the middle of this rush, one girl stood with her shoulders drawn just slightly inward, clutching her boarding pass as though it might vanish from her hands if she let go. Her name was Imani. She was only 15, but the confidence she had carried at the leadership camp earlier that week felt different now. There, among her peers, her voice had mattered. Here, among strangers with impatient stares and hurried steps, she felt small again. This trip was supposed to be a simple journey home, nothing more than a few hours in transit. Yet something about the way people glanced at her, the quick sizing up, the look that lingered too long on her braids, tightened her chest. Her father had always told her that true strength was found in humility. He reminded her often, wealth, titles, success, none of it meant anything if kindness was absent. Those words had settled deep in her heart, a shield she tried to hold up whenever someone treated her as less than she was. But even shields could grow heavy. The gate came into view. The attendant stood stiffly behind the counter, her name tag catching the light. Gloria. Her expression was unreadable, her lips pressed into a line that looked less like welcome and more like warning. Imani slowed her steps, nerves tightening around her like an invisible rope. She wasn't naive. She had felt judgment before. Subtle slights tucked behind false smiles, teachers who questioned her work more than others, whispers about what she probably couldn't afford. This felt like the beginning of one of those moments. And yet, she told herself, maybe she was wrong. Maybe this was just another routine check. Still, her palms grew damp as she approached the counter. If stories like this hold your attention, make sure to subscribe so you never miss what's next. And tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these stories travel. Ticket and passport, Gloria said, without looking up. The tone wasn't warm, it wasn't neutral either. It carried a sharp edge, as though Imani had already done something wrong simply by standing there. Imani handed them over, steadying her voice with a polite, "Yes, ma'am." Gloria's eyes flicked from the ticket to the passport, then to Imani. Up, down. A pause long enough to make the girl shift uneasily on her feet. For a moment, the attendant's gaze hardened, and Imani caught the faintest curl at the corner of her mouth. Something dismissive, something she had seen before in places where she wasn't wanted. Her pulse quickened. She told herself to breathe, to remember her father's lessons, to keep calm even if the world around her wasn't. The crowd pressed behind her, restless travelers waiting for their own turn, their sighs and shifting footsteps adding weight to the air. Gloria didn't hurry. Instead, she studied the paper again, as though hunting for a flaw that wasn't there. Imani's voice nearly broke the silence. "Is there a problem?" Gloria's lips tightened. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice but not her disdain. "This ticket doesn't look valid." The words struck harder than the noise of rolling luggage or the beeps of scanning machines. Imani felt her stomach twist, not because the claim was true, but because of how it was said, like an accusation, not a question. The girl straightened her back, her heart hammering in her chest. She had been taught to stand with dignity, no matter who doubted her. But dignity was harder to hold when the ground beneath you threatened to give way. And as Gloria's fingers pressed against the paper, her nails digging in as if preparing to tear, Imani realized something was about to happen that would change the course of her day in a way she couldn't yet name. Then, with a sudden motion, Gloria's hands tightened on the boarding pass. Gloria's gaze lingered too long on the name printed in bold letters, then drifted up toward Imani's braids. It wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion dressed as scrutiny, a look that weighed more than words. Her eyes narrowed, and the corner of her mouth twitched as if she had already made up her mind about the girl standing in front of her. "This doesn't look right," Gloria said, her voice cold, clipped. Imani forced her tone steady. "It's the ticket my father booked for me. Everything should be fine." The attendant let out a small, humorless laugh. "I've seen plenty of passengers like you try to get through with fake bookings." The phrase hit harder than the words themselves. Passengers like you. Not travelers, not guests, but a category set apart, reduced to stereotype. Imani's stomach turned, her father's lessons of humility and dignity colliding with the sting of being singled out for nothing more than who she was. Behind her, a few travelers shifted closer, eager for the line to move. Their curiosity sharpened the humiliation. Imani could feel their eyes pressing into her back, whispers rising like static in the air. A boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, asking what was wrong, and the woman leaned down, answering in a hush that wasn't quiet enough. The girl's cheeks burned. She wasn't angry yet. Anger required space to breathe. What she felt was smaller, meaner, the squeeze of being cornered, of having her truth doubted before it was even spoken. "Ma'am," she said, soft but firm, "this is a legitimate ticket. Could you scan it again?" Gloria didn't move. She kept staring, eyes flicking once more over the braids, then back to the ticket. "Don't argue. If it's real, it wouldn't look this suspicious." Imani's hands trembled, not from guilt, but from the weight of knowing the situation wasn't about paper or ink. It was about perception, about how someone decided in a moment that she didn't belong. The crowd behind her shifted again, impatient. Someone muttered, "Hurry up already." Another chuckled under their breath. A knot twisted in Imani's throat, but she swallowed it down. She refused to cry, not here, not in front of strangers who would walk away with a story about a girl who couldn't keep herself together. Her fingers pressed against the strap of her backpack, grounding herself in its weight. "Please," she said quietly, "this ticket is valid." Gloria's lips curved into something colder than a smile. "Don't try to fool me." And then, without warning, the attendant's hands moved. Her fingers tightened on the paper, nails digging into the flimsy material. The pause was brief, deliberate, a heartbeat, nothing more. Then came the sound. Rip. The tearing cut through the murmur of the terminal, sharper than the beeping scanners and rolling suitcases. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. Imani's eyes widened as the pieces dangled from Gloria's fingers, once whole, now ruined. It wasn't just paper being destroyed, it was the permission to belong, the right to move forward, torn in half by someone who had already judged her guilty. "That's not valid," Gloria declared, tossing the halves aside like scraps. Her voice was louder now, enough for those in line to hear. "Move along, little girl. You're not boarding this flight." The whispers thickened. A man muttered something about scammers. A woman shook her head, eyes filled with pity. Others looked away, pretending not to notice at all. Heat surged through Imani's chest, climbing to her throat, but the words caught there, trapped. She had always believed dignity was a shield, but in that moment, the shield cracked. She wanted to shout, to demand justice, but the crowd's silence pressed harder than Gloria's voice ever could. Her hands shook as she bent to pick up the torn halves. The paper felt fragile now, powerless, like proof shredded into doubt. Gloria had already turned to the next passenger, ignoring her completely, as if Imani's presence no longer existed. And so the girl stood frozen, holding the ruined ticket in her hands, surrounded by strangers, her pulse hammering with one truth that settled like stone. She had been humiliated not for what she did, but for who she was. And in that silence, the question burned, what could she possibly do next? For a moment, the world around her blurred into background noise, boarding calls echoing, luggage wheels grinding, the hum of impatient travelers pressing forward. Imani could only stare at the shredded ticket in her hands. It didn't matter how tightly she held the pieces together. The gap between them wouldn't close. Her chest rose and fell unevenly. She fought to steady her breathing, to remind herself of her father's words. Stand tall. Know your worth. But worth didn't stop the stares digging into her back, the whispers that branded her before she had a chance to defend herself. Her phone felt heavy in her pocket, as if calling him meant admitting she couldn't fix this alone. She hated that. At camp, she had been praised for her independence, her quick mind, her ability to lead. Here, she felt like a child again, reduced to nothing by the flick of someone else's hand. Finally, with trembling fingers, she pulled the phone out and pressed his number. He answered on the second ring. "Imani? You should be boarding by now." Her throat tightened. "Dad, there's a problem." He picked up the hesitation immediately. His voice sharpened. "Tell me." The attendant, she said my ticket wasn't valid, and then she tore it. For a beat, there was only silence on the other end. Not disbelief, not confusion. Something heavier. The kind of silence that gathers before a storm. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that steadied her shaking hands. "Where exactly are you standing?" she told him, forcing her voice not to break as people jostled around her. "Stay there," he said firmly. "Don't move. I'll handle this." The line went dead. Imani closed her eyes for a moment, gripping the ruined ticket. His tone replayed in her head, not panicked, not dismissive, but controlled, laced with an anger that rarely surfaced in her father. She had always known him as calm, humble, never one to boast about who he was or what he owned. But she also knew this. When his voice dropped into that measured register, action was already in motion. Most of the passengers crowding the gate had no idea that the man on the other end of that call wasn't just a parent coming to his daughter's defense. Marcus Imani Coates was the quiet force behind one of the largest airline empires in the world. He had built it from a modest charter service into a global powerhouse, yet he rarely appeared in headlines. For years, he had chosen anonymity, preferring his work to speak louder than his name. Imani thought about that now, how he had warned her about moments like this when prejudice would outweigh truth. He had told her, "People will see your skin before they see your achievements. They will measure you against their assumptions, not your potential. And you must remember, it is not you who is small, it is their vision that is limited." And yet, even with that wisdom, the humiliation still cut deep. Wealth couldn't stop the sting of being dismissed as if she didn't belong. Power couldn't erase the flush of shame that came with being doubted in public. She stood near the wall, away from the flow of the line, clutching her phone in one hand and the scraps of her ticket in the other. Passengers still glanced at her, some with pity, others with the kind of avoidance that said, "Not my problem." That was the cruelty of it. Racism didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered through silence, through the choice to look away. Somewhere across the city, her father was already moving. She could imagine him stepping out of his office, his staff startled by the suddenness of his departure. He wasn't a man who wasted words, and the silence after she had spoken told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't going to be brushed aside. Still, she felt the weight of waiting. Each second stretched, her pulse loud in her ears. Her mind replayed the moment over and over, Gloria's eyes narrowing, the dismissive flick of her hand, the sound of the paper tearing. It didn't matter that she was the daughter of the man who owned the airline. In that moment, she had been reduced to a stereotype, judged and dismissed like countless others without anyone to defend them. And that was the part that stung most. She knew she was lucky. Her father's name carried weight, his presence commanded respect. But what about the others? The people who couldn't make a phone call and change the course of an entire airport? For them, humiliation lingered without resolution. Her jaw tightened. She didn't just want her father to come fix this for her. She wanted accountability, proof that someone like Gloria couldn't wield prejudice unchecked. A group of passengers walked past, one of them murmuring just loud enough for her to catch, always trying to sneak through. The words weren't aimed directly at her, but they cut all the same. She lowered her gaze, pressing her lips together, refusing to let the tears spill. And then, in the corner of her vision, movement. Security guards stepped aside. A tall figure in a tailored suit cut through the crowd with quiet authority. His expression was unreadable, his stride steady, and though most of the travelers had no idea who he was, the staff did. Heads turned. Whispers rose. Imani's breath caught in her throat. Her father had arrived, and from the look on his face, the storm was only beginning. In a corner office overlooking the city skyline, Marcus Imani Coates had been wrapping up a call with international partners when his phone buzzed. He rarely interrupted meetings, but the name flashing on the screen erased every other concern. His daughter's voice had been steady when she spoke, but he heard what lingered beneath, the crack of humiliation, the strain of someone holding themselves together while the world pulled at their dignity. By the time she finished explaining, his chair was already pushed back. Papers sat abandoned on his desk, the conference call forgotten. He issued a single instruction to his assistant, cancel everything, and walked out without another word. His staff stared, startled by the rare urgency etched into his face. He was a man known for calm control, the type who built empires brick by brick with steady hands. But beneath that quiet exterior lived something fiercer. A father who would not let his child's worth be questioned. Outside, a black company car was waiting. The driver opened the door, but Marcus waved him aside and slid into the back seat without hesitation. The door shut with a thud, sealing his decision. Airport, now. The city blurred past the tinted glass, but Marcus didn't notice the lights or the flow of traffic. His mind replayed her words. She said the ticket wasn't valid. She tore it. That single image burned into him. A ticket, flimsy paper, destroyed in front of strangers. Not because it was false, but because his daughter's skin had marked her suspect before she opened her mouth. His jaw tightened. He had spent decades building an airline that prided itself on fairness, on treating every passenger as more than a seat number. He had stepped in personally when employees faced hardship, paid hospital bills, arranged scholarships for staff children, covered funeral costs when tragedies struck. Compassion had always been his compass. And now the company that bore his family name had humiliated his daughter in front of an entire terminal. The hypocrisy of it cut deeper than any business betrayal. As the car sped through traffic, Marcus's thoughts shifted between anger and purpose. He didn't often reveal who he was to the public. Power, he believed, was best exercised with humility. But humility had its limits. Today, it would not be mistaken for silence. Meanwhile, at the airport, Amani sat near a wide window, her backpack resting against her legs, the ruined ticket folded carefully in her hand. She hadn't moved far from the gate. Leaving would feel like admitting guilt. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Stay there. So she stayed, even as whispers trailed past her. Children pointed before being hushed by parents. Some passengers shot her glances filled with pity, others with quiet scorn. Most ignored her altogether, too wrapped in their own departures. But through it all, one presence remained constant. Gloria, standing tall behind the counter, her lips curved ever so slightly into a smirk. She kept working with other travelers, her politeness sharpened into performance, but every so often she looked toward Amani as if savoring her victory. That expression carved itself into the girl's memory, more painful than the torn ticket itself. It wasn't just dismissal. It was delight in reminding someone where she thought they belonged. Amani tightened her grip on the paper scraps. She wanted to walk back up, to demand acknowledgement, but she knew any word she spoke would be twisted against her. So she sat, still and silent, the humiliation pressing heavier with each passing minute. The intercom announced boarding for another flight nearby. Families gathered their belongings. Couples wheeled luggage toward jet bridges. Around her, life moved on, but she remained frozen in place. She told herself to be strong, but inside, her chest felt hollow. Across the city, the car pulled into the airport's executive entrance. Security officers straightened the moment Marcus stepped out. His suit was simple, his movements unhurried, yet there was something in his stride that silenced questions. People sensed it instinctively, the difference between ordinary authority and the presence of someone who carried entire industries on his shoulders. He did not pause to shake hands or issue greetings. His eyes, dark with resolve, were locked on one destination. He had come not as a CEO, not as the silent force behind an airline empire, but as a father answering the call of his child. Inside, Amani felt the weight of another stare. She looked up and saw staff members murmuring, a shift in the air as whispers moved faster than boarding announcements. A few glanced toward the entrance, their faces pale. She followed their eyes. Through the glass doors at the end of the concourse, a tall figure emerged, cutting through the tide of passengers with quiet command. For the first time since the ticket had been torn, Imani's breath caught with something new. Relief. Her father had arrived, and with him came the kind of storm no one in that terminal was prepared to face. He crossed the concourse with steady purpose, the crowd parting out of instinct rather than instruction. Imani rose from the seat by the window, torn paper still folded in her hand. For a second, she looked younger than her years. Then his arms went around her, and the tremor in her shoulders eased. Public shame met private comfort, and the balance tipped. When they stepped apart, he took the two halves of the ticket and examined the jagged edges. No flare of voice, no theatrics, only a long, controlled breath, as if measuring the distance between what should have happened and what did. "Stay with me," he said. They walked to the gate counter together. Conversations dulled around them. A gate agent glanced up, froze, and nudged a colleague. Recognition moved through the staff row like a hush. Badges straightened. Smiles appeared too quickly. Someone fumbled a greeting and didn't finish it. "Supervisor," he said, eyes fixed on the name placard on the desk. "Now." A man in a dark blazer came forward, smoothing his tie as he approached. "Richard, Gate Operations," he introduced himself. "Sir, is there an—" "There is," he replied, setting the torn halves on the counter with care. "Your employee destroyed a valid boarding pass and degraded my daughter in front of a line of passengers." Richard's gaze flicked to the paper, then to Imani, then past her, toward the attendant. "Gloria," he called, his voice tight. "Step over." Gloria joined them, posture rigid. She did not look at Imani. She stared at the ticket scraps as if they were evidence against her, and shook her head as if they were evidence for her. "That pass looked wrong," she said. "I was protecting the airline." A murmur rippled behind them. The phrase had weight to it, not because it carried truth, but because of what it brushed aside. He kept his tone even. "You tore a valid ticket. You humiliated my child." Gloria's jaw worked. "I've seen scams. I acted to prevent one." "By destroying a passenger's document?" His eyes didn't leave her face. "There are procedures when something appears off: verification, secondary ID checks, supervisor review. You used none of them." Richard stepped in, a hand raised as if to slow a slide. "Sir, I'm sure we can." "Can you?" he asked, still calm. "Because what happened here wasn't a mistake with a keystroke. It was a decision. The kind that tells a 15-year-old she doesn't belong before you've even opened a system log." Gloria finally looked at Imani, then looked away just as quickly, settling on a spot beyond the girl's shoulder. "I followed my judgment. There are patterns." "Patterns," he repeated, quiet enough that Richard had to lean in to hear. "Describe one." Gloria hesitated. The room seemed to tighten. Nearby agents pretended to rearrange papers that didn't need arranging. A family in line stopped whispering and simply watched. "Certain bookings," Gloria said at last, voice thinning. "Certain names, cash equivalents, one-way routes. We see them." "And braids?" he asked. "Do you see those too?" Color rose in her cheeks. "That is not what I said." "No," he agreed. "You didn't have to." Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Sir, let's step to a side desk. We don't need to handle this in the open." "In the open," he said, "is where you handled her." He turned the torn ticket slightly, as if aligning two halves of a story that should match if anyone had bothered to check. "You're going to walk me through your station logs for the last 30 minutes. Scanner history, ID prompts, any rejection flags." "We can pull those," Richard said quickly. "I apologize on behalf of our team for any distress caused." "Distress wasn't caused by air pressure," he answered. "It was caused by bias wearing a uniform." Gloria crossed her arms. "You're twisting this. I was protecting the airline. We can't let passengers like—" She caught herself, but the sentence hung there, unfinished and complete at the same time. His eyes moved to her badge, then back to her face. "You were protecting the airline," he said softly. "From whom?" Imani stood close enough that he could feel her steadying beside him, no longer shaking, just tired of being the lesson in someone else's training. The line behind them had stopped pretending not to listen. A few phones hovered chest high, not recording, not exactly, just held in a way that said the owners might raise them at any second. Richard shifted his weight. "Let's move, please. We can resolve this professionally." "Professionally would have been verifying before tearing," he said. "Professionally would have been addressing concerns without an audience." A junior agent appeared with a tablet, eyes wide, shoulder lifting in a question. Richard grabbed it like a lifeline. "We'll review scans," he promised. "We'll reissue boarding immediately. I'll file the incident. We'll make this right." He didn't look at the tablet. He looked at Gloria. "Say the part you've avoided." She blinked. "What part?" "The reason you didn't call a supervisor before you ripped that document. The reason you raised your voice right. The reason a child is holding scraps of paper instead of a seat assignment." Gloria swallowed. "I told you. It looked wrong." "It looked like her," he said, the words no louder than before, but sharper now. "And you decided that was wrong enough." Silence pressed in. Richard's smile collapsed into something honest, worry. The junior agent took a half step back. The family in line exchanged glances, some embarrassed, some angry, some simply stunned by how easy it had been for a stranger to be treated as less. He placed the two halves of the ticket side by side again, the tier line forming a crooked seam. "Here's what happens next," he said, eyes still on Gloria. "We pull every record tied to this gate in the last hour. We document each step you did and didn't take, and we correct the culture that told you tearing was faster than thinking." Gloria's chin rose a fraction. "I was protecting the airline." He met her gaze and didn't blink. From a 15-year-old who followed every rule. She opened her mouth, then closed it, finding no cover in the script she'd used 100 times on people who couldn't push back. Around them, the air held steady and still. Richard exhaled, defeated. Somewhere down the concourse, a boarding group was called for another flight, but no one at this counter moved. Gloria set her shoulders as if bracing for impact and repeated, weaker now, "I was protecting the airline." And with that, the last defense she had left was the one that would have to be tested, line by line, in a room she could no longer control. The hum of the terminal faded as they were led down a narrow hallway, away from the curious stares and half-raised phones. The side office they entered was small, lined with metal filing cabinets and a desk that had seen better days. The blinds on the single window hung crooked, filtering slivers of sunlight across the floor. It was the kind of room meant to bury problems, not resolve them. Inside, the silence settled heavy. Richard, the supervisor, gestured stiffly toward a set of chairs. "Please, have a seat." Marcus didn't move at first. His presence filled the space without effort, a calm that wasn't soothing but commanding. Imani remained close to him, still holding the scraps of the ticket, her face tight with the kind of restraint only a teenager forced to grow up quickly could muster. Gloria stood by the wall, her arms crossed, eyes darting anywhere but toward them. Finally, Marcus spoke. "She doesn't sit in the corner, she sits by me." He guided Imani into the chair beside his, then folded the torn ticket and set it carefully on the desk between them. Richard cleared his throat, his voice faltering under the weight of expectation. "Mr. Imani Coates, we take these matters very seriously." Marcus cut in, his tone calm but unyielding. "No, you don't. If you did, she wouldn't be holding shredded proof of her right to travel." The words landed like stone against glass. Richard shifted uneasily, his attempt at corporate polish slipping away. Gloria finally spoke, her voice thin but defensive. "I followed my judgment. I believed the document was fraudulent." Marcus turned to her, his expression steady. "Judgment isn't a license to humiliate. There are procedures, checks, systems built to prevent mistakes. You skipped every one of them because you thought her presence didn't deserve the courtesy of verification." Gloria's lips pressed into a line. She had no rebuttal. Imani stared at the floor, the burn of shame still fresh, but her father placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. His voice softened for a moment. "This isn't only about my daughter. She will go home today. She will heal from the sting of this." Then his gaze hardened again, sweeping across Richard and Gloria. But how many others have been dismissed, accused, torn apart in silence, without anyone to defend them? The question lingered. The room shrank under its weight. He leaned forward, fingers resting on the folded ticket. Justice doesn't whisper. It demands to be heard. And what happened at your gate is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of something far larger. A culture where bias is allowed to hide under the guise of protecting the airline. Richard attempted to recover, his voice a forced calm. "We can investigate the specific behavior and issue disciplinary action." "This isn't about disciplining one employee," Marcus said sharply, though his tone never rose. "It's about dismantling the quiet permission given to people who see a black child and immediately assume fraud. Do you understand how many passengers carry that weight every time they approach a counter? How many choose silence because they don't have the luxury of calling someone like me?" Imani lifted her head then, her father's words pulling her upright. She felt the truth of it deep in her chest. Her humiliation wasn't unique. It was shared by countless others whose names no one would ever learn. Gloria shifted, arms tightening across her chest. "You're exaggerating. I treat everyone the same." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Do you? Would you have torn up the ticket of a child with pale skin and blonde hair, Or would you have scanned it again, asked a supervisor, given her the benefit of the doubt. Silence. Richard rubbed his forehead, sweat beginning to form along his hairline. We have training modules. We encourage sensitivity. I'll admit this was mishandled, but... Mishandled, Marcus repeated, the word sharp enough to cut. You call it mishandling. I call it humiliation. She'll remember this long after you've logged your report and moved on to the next passenger. He stood then, the chair legs scraping against the floor. The room seemed smaller when he rose to his full height. This airline was built on the promise of safe passage. If safety only applies to those who fit a certain image, then that promise is broken. Amani looked at him, her father's figure steady and unshaken. For the first time since her ticket had been ripped, she felt the humiliation begin to shift into something else. Resolve. Richard swallowed hard. Mr. Amani Coates, please. Allow us to correct this. Marcus studied the two halves of the ticket, then looked back at Gloria, who avoided his eyes. Correction begins with accountability. But it will not end in this room. The words hit like a gavel. He gathered the scraps of paper, placed them in his breast pocket, and adjusted his suit jacket with deliberate calm. This isn't about one gate, one flight, or one employee. This is about the culture you allow to persist, and I will ensure it changes. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst could have been. Richard's mouth opened, then closed, his voice lost. Gloria's smirk from earlier was gone, replaced by the pale stillness of someone who realized the ground had shifted beneath her. Marcus turned to his daughter. Let's go. As they stepped out of the small office, the murmur of the terminal returned. But Amani noticed how the staff at the counters stiffened, how whispers spread faster now. Her father's presence was no longer a secret. And though no announcement had been made, everyone would soon learn that this confrontation was only the beginning of something much larger. Back in the terminal, the low buzz of voices trailed them like shadows. Whispers ran ahead as Marcus and Amani approached the gate again, staff stepping aside as if unsure whether to greet him or retreat. The torn ticket weighed in his pocket, but its absence in her hand weighed heavier still. Richard tried to recover composure, smoothing his blazer as he motioned for them toward the counter. His words stumbled. Mr. Amani Coates, I, on behalf of our staff, want to apologize. This was unacceptable. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the silence settle, his eyes fixed on Gloria, who stood rigid behind the counter. She avoided Amani's gaze, clinging to the plastic smile she wore like armor. Say it, Marcus said at last. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried, cutting through the terminal noise. Not to me, to her. Gloria blinked, her lips tightening as if the simple instruction had turned her throat to stone. A long pause stretched, uncomfortable and raw, before she finally turned her head toward Amani. I'm sorry if I offended you, she muttered, her eyes darting away almost instantly. The words fell flat, cold. They held no weight, no acknowledgement of the humiliation delivered so publicly. It wasn't apology, it was performance, delivered only because her supervisor stood beside her, and the man she had wronged now held power in the room. Amani felt her stomach twist. For a moment, she wished the apology hadn't come at all. Words without sincerity cut deeper than silence. She wanted recognition, not pity. She wanted Gloria to admit what everyone had witnessed, that she had looked at a black teenager, assumed fraud, and ripped her dignity in half along with her boarding pass. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Not if. You did offend her. You did humiliate her. Respect isn't optional in this job. It is the foundation of it. Passengers trust you not just with their belongings or their tickets, but with their sense of safety. You've shattered that. Gloria's lips parted as if to respond, but nothing came. She folded her arms instead, retreating into the last shield she had left. Silence. Richard cleared his throat quickly, eager to pivot. Sir, Miss Imani, we've already reissued a replacement boarding pass. Given the circumstances, she's been upgraded to first class. Complimentary service, of course, and we'll ensure everything is handled smoothly from here. He handed the paper forward with both hands, as if the gesture itself could repair what had been broken. Imani took it slowly, her eyes scanning the seat number, the embossed airline logo, the neat print of her name. It was perfect on the surface, exactly what she should have had from the beginning. But the weight in her chest didn't ease. The new pass wasn't a gift. It was compensation dressed as kindness, a token meant to plaster over the wound without cleaning it. She looked at Gloria again. The woman's jaw was tight, her eyes distant, already moving on to the next passenger in her mind. There was no remorse there, no recognition of what had truly been done. Marcus saw it too. He leaned forward slightly, his voice measured but sharp. A seat upgrade does not erase the insult. Don't mistake replacement for repair. Richard nodded quickly, but his eyes betrayed the nervousness of someone balancing between protecting the company and placating a man he now realized could dismantle him with a single call. Amani slipped the new boarding pass into her bag, her hands steady now. Yet inside, the disappointment pressed down. She had imagined an apology might bring relief, but this one left her emptier. It was hollow, the kind of apology given not from recognition of harm, but from fear of consequence. The truth struck her then. The wound wasn't the torn ticket. It was the message that had come with it. People like you don't belong here. No upgrade could rewrite that sentence. Around them, the crowd shifted back into motion. Boarding groups for other flights were called, children laughed, travelers scrolled through phones. To anyone passing by, it looked as if the moment had passed. But Amani knew it would follow her far beyond this terminal. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to carry her words. They were never about you. They were about her. Amani nodded, though the ache remained. She understood what he meant, but she also knew she wasn't the only one who had heard Gloria's words. Everyone in line that day had witnessed it. The insult had echoed louder than the apology ever could. Naomi's reflection lingered. Apologies without accountability are nothing more than empty air. They don't heal. They don't restore. They sting deeper because they remind the victim that the pain was acknowledged yet dismissed in the same breath. Marcus straightened, his voice quiet but resolute. This doesn't end here. It can't. And though he didn't say how, the certainty in his tone left no doubt. What Gloria thought was over had only just begun. The new boarding pass was in her bag, but Marcus didn't stop at that. He stepped toward the counter again, his voice calm yet commanding. Book me on the same flight, first class, next to her. Richard hesitated, blinking. Of course, sir. One moment. Agents scrambled at their terminals, suddenly efficient, tapping furiously as if afraid of delay. Within minutes, Marcus had his seat confirmed, the printer spitting out a pristine boarding pass. He took it without looking at the agent, then returned to his daughter's side. Ready? He asked. Amani nodded, though her chest still felt heavy. The upgrade meant comfort, but not erasure. Still, with her father beside her, the smirk on Gloria's face no longer held power. When boarding was called, the staff seemed to transform. The same attendants who had watched silently as humiliation unfolded now stood straighter, smiles stretched wider, voices too sweet. This way, sir. Right this way. We'll take care of everything. The hypocrisy was impossible to miss. Just an hour earlier, Amani had been disposable, dismissed as though she had no right to the seat she'd paid for. Now, with Marcus walking beside her, she was untouchable. Passengers noticed too. Eyes followed them down the jet bridge, some filled with recognition, others with curiosity. Whispers spread from row to row before they even reached their seats. Faces softened into quick nods of respect, the same people who had looked through her moments earlier, now craning to acknowledge her father. The cabin crew hovered, offering assistance at every step. Would you like water before takeoff? Can I hang your jackets? Is the seat to your liking? Imani sank into the wide leather seat, the hum of the cabin a world apart from the chaos at the gate. Yet even in luxury, she felt the sting of how quickly perception had shifted, not because of who she was, but because of who her father was. Marcus leaned toward her, his voice quiet. I wanted you to see something today. Not just their prejudice, but their change. Status shouldn't dictate respect, but it does. That's why we fight to break it. She looked at him, the steady calm in his eyes softening her own resolve. It's not fair, she whispered. It never is, he replied, but it can be challenged, every time. The plane filled with the bustle of passengers stowing bags and finding seats. Some stole glances toward them, recognition spreading as Marcus adjusted his jacket and spoke briefly with a crew member. Phones tilted subtly, passengers pretending to scroll while sneaking photos. The atmosphere around them shifted from indifference to deference. Imani felt the contradiction pressing against her chest. Only an hour ago, whispers had branded her suspect. Now, those same voices whispered differently. Admiration, curiosity, envy. The duality was jarring, disposable, then untouchable. She rested her head back against the seat, staring at the ceiling panels above. Why does it have to take power for people to see you? Marcus didn't answer right away. He studied her, his expression both proud and pained. Because some people only see what they expect. It's easier to label than to listen. But that's why you don't let their labels define you. You define yourself, and you let their small visions stay theirs. She turned toward him, her voice steadying. Do you think she'll change? The woman at the gate? His eyes hardened. Change is rarely born from forced apologies, but systems can change. That's where the real fight is. The engines rumbled as the plane began to push back from the gate. Imani glanced out the window, the ground crew shrinking below, the terminal glowing under bright lights. Somewhere behind those walls, Gloria was likely back at her post, her smirk gone but her bias still intact. The thought made Imani's jaw tighten, but she found strength in knowing her father wouldn't let the moment die in silence. The plane taxied, gathering speed, then lifted into the sky. The city lights fell away beneath them, replaced by a stretch of dark horizon. Imani exhaled, the tension loosening at last. For the first time since the ticket had been torn, she felt steady. Her father's hand rested lightly on her arm, grounding her. You held your dignity today, Marcus said softly. Don't forget that. She tried to strip it from you, and you didn't let her. Imani gave a small nod. She had wanted to cry, to scream, but she had stood. That mattered. The seatbelt light blinked off. A flight attendant approached with practiced grace. Mr. Imani Coates, Miss Imani, can I bring you something to drink? Her tone dripped with respect, each syllable carefully placed. Imani almost laughed at the contrast. How quickly service turned when someone's worth was tied to a last name. Marcus simply shook his head. We're fine. The attendant bowed slightly and moved away. Imani glanced at her father again. She felt safer, yes, but she also felt something else, responsibility. Because if her safety depended on his presence, what about the children who had no one to step in? She tightened her seatbelt as the plane steadied in the air, her reflection catching in the window beside her. 1 hour ago, she thought, I was treated as nothing. Now, because of him, I'm treated as everything. But the truth is, I've been the same person all along. And with that realization, she promised herself she would carry more than her father's name. She would carry the fight. The plane dipped through a bank of clouds, the distant glow of the city rising to meet it. Seatbelts clicked, trays locked, and the cabin fell into the hushed anticipation that always came before landing. For Imani, the descent felt like release. The end of a journey that had begun not at the camp she left that morning, but at the gate where her dignity had been torn in half. She glanced at her father beside her. His posture was straight, composed, yet she could sense the current beneath it. He wasn't finished. The storm inside him was controlled, but not calmed. The wheels touched down with a jolt, applause breaking from a few scattered passengers. For Imani, the sound was hollow. She hadn't flown through turbulence in the sky. She had endured it on the ground. As they taxied toward the gate, she leaned closer. Do you think it's really over? Marcus turned his head slowly, his expression firm. No, it's only beginning. When the doors opened, the first-class passengers were ushered off with the same exaggerated courtesy that had replaced silence earlier. Flight attendants bent their smiles toward Marcus, eager to impress. Their tone with him was reverent, though the memory of how they had watched her humiliation at boarding still clung like a shadow. The terminal lights on this side of the journey seemed warmer, the space less hostile. Yet Imani knew the difference wasn't the airport, it was her father's presence. Alone, she might have walked out of another gate, invisible and dismissed. Together, she was shielded by a name that carried power. In the car that waited for them, Marcus finally spoke at length. His words weren't rushed. They came deliberate, like each one was a brick laid in the foundation of something larger. I've spent years building an airline people trust, but what happened today shows trust isn't built on planes or polished lounges. It's built on people, and people fail when prejudice is allowed to guide them. That has to change. Amani studied him, her disappointment and pride tangled into one. How? Training, he said. Real training. Not a box to tick on a computer screen. Policies rewritten to hold employees accountable. Supervisors instructed to intervene, not excuse. Every level reminded that respect is non-negotiable. She nodded slowly, absorbing the certainty in his tone. His voice wasn't just a promise to her. It was a vow to every traveler who had faced what she had faced without anyone to defend them. But her thoughts drifted to those very people. The single mother told to step aside because her payment was suspicious. The elderly man questioned twice as long because his name was unfamiliar. The teenager flying alone who wasn't lucky enough to have a father whose voice could shake a terminal. She pressed her forehead lightly to the cool window of the car, city lights streaking past. What about the people who don't have someone like you? Marcus's hand rested on her shoulder. His tone softened, but his words stayed sharp. That's why exposure matters. Every time injustice is dragged into the open, it chips away at the shield of silence that protects it. My presence gives weight, but your voice gives truth. People will listen to what you lived, and in listening, some will begin to change. Her chest swelled, not with relief but with a dawning sense of responsibility. She remembered the leadership camp, the late-night talks about goals and futures. Some friends wanted to start companies, others dreamed of leading charities or becoming scientists. She hadn't known then what her path would be, but today had carved one possibility in stone. She wanted to fight against the quiet cruelty that had tried to diminish her. At a stoplight, Marcus looked at her reflection in the window. What happened to you today wasn't right, but it can shape you if you let it. You can be more than my daughter. You can be a leader in your own right. The words pressed deep, leaving her both unsettled and inspired. She hadn't asked for this moment, hadn't wanted to be the lesson in someone else's bias. Yet here she was, and here was the chance to turn it into something that mattered. They arrived at home just past dusk. The front steps lit softly in the evening. As she stepped out of the car, Amani felt lighter but also more determined. The humiliation hadn't vanished, it lingered, sharp and unforgotten. But alongside it grew something stronger. Resolve. Naomi's reflection sharpened the truth. Not everyone has a father who can walk into an airport and change the course of an entire flight. Not everyone has a name that commands silence where there was once ridicule. But every act of exposure, every refusal to shrink back into silence, chips away at the injustice that hides in plain sight. And as Marcus looked toward the house, his voice steady with promise, the fight he planned would reach further than a single gate, a single employee, or even a single airline. This was no longer just about Amani. It was about everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. The night was quiet when they stepped through the door of their home, but silence did not mean peace. For Amani, the weight of the day pressed into her bones, a memory she knew would never fade. The ticket had been replaced, the flight completed, the journey home secured. But the wound remained. Not in the paper torn at the counter, but in the way she had been reduced to nothing in front of strangers who chose to watch rather than speak. A torn ticket was just paper, but the wound of prejudice cuts deeper. That single moment at the gate told a story older than she was, one lived by countless travelers who never had the power of a last name to shield them. Men and women pulled aside for random checks that were never random. Children eyed with suspicion before their voices could even explain. Mothers questioned for fraudulent payments, fathers treated as threats, entire families stared at as if belonging was something they had to prove. Amani's father had stepped in and changed the ending. But what about those who boarded buses instead of planes? Who walked through terminals alone, who didn't have a figure of influence to call? Their humiliation wasn't corrected. Their apologies never came. Their stories were buried in the silence of public spaces where people look away because standing up feels inconvenient. Justice, when it came, was often selective. Today, it had spoken because Marcus had the power to demand it. But true justice could not remain a privilege of status. It had to become a right lived by everyone. Naomi's voice lingered on that truth. Justice doesn't whisper, it demands to be heard. And yet too often, its cry goes ignored until someone powerful forces the world to listen. That imbalance is the very heart of racism, the way value shifts not on character, but on perception. 1 hour, Imani had been disposable. The next, untouchable. Yet through it all, she remained the same girl. Dignified, intelligent, worthy. For viewers, the lesson is not about wealth or influence. It is about exposure. Every story spoken aloud chips at the armor of silence that shields prejudice. Each time discrimination is dragged into the light, someone else finds courage to say, "That happened to me too." So the question turns to you. Have you ever faced discrimination while traveling? Have you ever been told you didn't belong? Not because of what you carried, but because of who you are. Share your story in the comments. The silence that protects prejudice is strongest when we keep quiet. But when we speak, when we connect, when we refuse to let humiliation be the last word, change becomes possible. And if you believe no child should ever be humiliated because of their race, if you believe dignity should never be torn apart as easily as paper, then like this video, subscribe, and join the voice of Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Every story told here is a reminder that injustice doesn't get to write the ending. We do. Imani's journey will not vanish from memory, nor should it. It will stand as both a wound and a weapon, a reminder of what must be fought and what must never be repeated. Her father's promise was reform, but reform begins not in policy, but in people. People willing to see beyond skin, beyond bias, beyond assumption. The humiliation she endured cannot be undone, but the strength she carried forward cannot be denied. And in that strength lives the possibility of something greater. A world where boarding a plane isn't an act of courage, but simply a step toward home. Hate rips, justice repairs, but dignity must always be protected.